In a world where many people see reality as a circle or a rectangle, the truth is that issues are cylinders. Rather than a two-dimensional understanding, we will flush out the three-dimension complexities through nuanced conversation and civil, respectable discourse to highlight all perspectives on controversial issues. I'm your host, William Roosh, a high school teacher who's trying to transform education as we know it. Welcome to the Anti-Echo Chamber. This is Cylinder Radio. Hello and welcome to the next lesson, the next episode of Cylinder Radio. Today, my guest is Lex Horwitz, they, them pronouns. They are a special education teacher for reading and math, currently at University of Pennsylvania studying urban education and special education, and also a transgender activist. So we are going to be talking about LGBT education and the best ways to educate around all of the issues with gender and sexuality and stuff like that for different ages of kids. And it's not always easy to have these conversations. So I really sincerely, before we get into anything, Lex, thank you. Thank you for your willingness to sit down and have this conversation, because the whole point of this podcast is to have respectful conversations and really try to just understand everything a little bit better, and that can only be done by having sometimes some difficult conversations. So I sincerely thank you so much. Please introduce yourself to my audience, and we can talk.
Sounds good. So my name is Lex. I use they, them pronouns. Born and raised in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I went to undergrad in Maine and received my degree in psychology and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. And like you said, I'm currently at Penn getting my master's and working as a special ed teacher. But in addition to helping youth, one of my other passions is LGBTQ advocacy and education. And the whole kind of moral and reason why I am so passionate about activism and advocacy is because I am privileged in the sense that I can be authentically myself because I have white skin. And since being on testosterone and having top surgery, I pass, which we can also get into what that means, as people assume that I'm a man, which automatically gives me more privilege for absolutely no reason, but because I look like I'm a man. And because I'm safe in the fact that my family is supportive of me and I'm not worried about losing my housing or any financial security, I can be visible and I can be authentically myself. And so I try to use my voice, or at least my platform, to share my own personal story. And I don't ever try to say that I'm the voice for anyone but myself. I think that's super important to say, because every single person, regardless of if they're trans or queer or what, literally any religion or other identity, can't speak for everyone. And so that's why I'm here. I am happy and privileged and super grateful that I am safe enough to be my authentic self in all the spaces that I go. That doesn't mean that I don't have to navigate and carefully choose when to disclose what information and not, just due to physical and mental safety. Mm-hmm. But that's happy to be here.
Yeah. So first of all, I think the fact that you just on your social media and stuff like that, and I'll put tags in when I post this, is you just this is me. This is me. This is who I am, is something that is really, really important for everybody. And it's one of those things where it's we want to be our best selves. Not just that was always my biggest issue with the self-esteem movement, was you're fine the way you are. And I always looked at it no, you could be better. You are just a bundle of unrealized potential. You could be better than you are. And maybe this even applies. I never really applied it to the trans community, but maybe it's even that there are people who have something inside of them that they feel well, this is who I am, and I'm more mixed up than I maybe could be. And I should be just my really authentic best version of myself. And I think that's really awesome. I also want to say the fact that you said that you speak for yourself is really, really important. I had on Danny Cesena, who is a transgender activist. And one of the things that Danny advocated for is he said, this is the way that transgender people, need to be addressed, and this is the way that they should be addressed, and this is the way that they, what you should say to them and things like that. And then I had Corinna Cohn on, who's also transgendered, and she said, well, I don't think that way. I think differently. And for me, who has had limited interactions with transgendered individuals, it was such an obvious thing to like anyone else. But like for me, it was like, oh, not all trans people think the same. And it's like, and that's something that happens when you don't have interactions with people from a specific group. If you don't have Black friends, then you think, you know what, I guess Black people think this way. It's like, no, they all think so differently. They're all individuals. And it's important that we meet a whole bunch of different people and hear that. And then we apply all of those nuances and all of these different stories and all these different things to how we approach people as individuals. Would you agree with that?
I definitely agree that approaching everyone as an individual it's key to like self-growth, and then also like building like genuine and just long-lasting relationships, or at the very least appreciation for people, is like through treating people as individuals. And I mean, through studying psych, we generalize people or groups of people into like schemas, so like mindsets that just makes it easier to navigate society.
For sure.
And so a lot of times that's where all of our like gendered or sex or race, whatever you want, like religion, all of those stereotypes comes from a place of just evolutionarily, we've had to do this to like more quickly. There goes one of my cats. Hi, Sabu. More quickly kind of navigate society in ways that like help us make like life or death change it. Like, oh, like if I see this bear, it's something that's big and it's furry. And that means that, okay, I've never seen this before, but I know that from the smaller things that are bigger, scary, with big teeth, like I need to run away. And so we've just kind of become accustomed to using our schemas when we don't need to, is how I understand it. Because there definitely is, like, something I would push back against what you said, like there definitely is a certain way to address or to understand transgender people and transgender, the trans community, especially in terms of language, in the same way that there's just specific ways in which you would navigate conversations on religion or ethnicity or race.
Right. Yeah,
absolutely. But I don't necessarily think that with gender or any topic, you can necessarily say this is the end all be all, especially because we use language for the sole purpose of being able to communicate our inner thoughts with other people. Yeah. And so we also created language. And so like I also studied like cognitive psych and like language production, and like the reasons why there are so many different cultures and societies that have not only like verbal language, but like tactile language or the written language or whatever it may be. It's all to share something that isn't tangible and make it as tangible as possible. And that's why so much language within the LGBTQ community has been like fostered and grown and created and expanded. And it's not unique to the LGBTQ community. All communities can be kind of not only redefining terms that we already have, but putting in new language to help us understand things that have already existed.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about that, because that's actually a way that you kind of structured that makes sense. So the reason I want to have these conversations also for this podcast is it's very intimidating to have conversations with people that are very different from yourself. And I want to model it. Like I had conversations with an abortion doctor, a pro-life feminist, a 15-year-old Black kid who's a diehard Trump supporter. I've had, like everything, conservative and liberal and, gay and straight and like, I want to just talk to everything, because I think that's how I want to be genuinely curious, but it's intimidating because you're scared. If you're an asshole, it's not intimidating at all. Because like, oh, if I hurt someone or offend someone, something like that, whatever. But if you're kind and you want to be an ally and you have good intentions in the world, I think that we all just need grace. And sometimes if someone gets something wrong, like if I would use the wrong pronoun or something like that, there are trans individuals who will smash you in some way, and just like, and I understand the same way that if someone says something to me like about the way that I identify, which would be like as a father, or something. Someone sees what I'm doing with my kid and like, you're a bad father. Like I would defend that. I would get really upset and offended. And so I understand it, but I think that we all just, the more grace that we can have, the more willingness to share who we are and show a little bit of vulnerability. I think that that's important. And that's why I just wanted to share with you, like, is that something that you're aware of, that individuals out in the world, if they know that you're trans, and they have questions, that they're kind of scared to bring up those questions?
Yes, actually. And it's actually really upsetting because the sole purpose of me being so visible and in turn so vulnerable is so that people can ask me questions and actually feel that I genuinely want people to ask me questions and that I won't be offended. And I've even found that young, like queer or even trans individuals will also be like intimidated, I guess is a better word, for reaching out to me to ask me questions. Whether it's because like the numbers on Instagram make me look like I'm unapproachable, which I think is super unfortunate because like I said, I respond to every single like instant message that I get on Instagram.
You're on here, yeah.
And I'm constantly like mentoring and providing products to, and just like telling people that they're valid. Like it's what I do every day. And I make sure that everyone that contacts me knows that like I genuinely care about them. But it's definitely something that people, whether they are cisgender or like queer or questioning, whatever it may be, for some reason, people find me intimidating.
Yeah. I get it.
Yeah. But I'm also like a very competitive person. I was a collegiate athlete. And so I got like, you're intimidating a lot from that as well. But also a lot of it could be that because I recently started my medical transition and had only recently come out as like a non-binary trans person. Mm-hmm. So for the majority of my life, people assumed that I was a straight cisgender woman. And so as someone who is who people assumed was a masculine appearing woman, being really intense and competitive in athletics, made me seem like I was intimidating or I was aggressive, and kind of labeled me with negative stereotypes that if I were a man or a boy doing the same exact things, I would be revered as brave and strong and a go-getter and like the head of the next Nike documentary or whatever it may be. And it's just interesting the ways in which the lens shifts from when I was assumed to be a woman athlete to being a man as an athlete, and the language used within that as well.
When you say, so I have like three kind of points that I want to hit, like, but when you say using the word queer, I have a question about that because I say like LGBT typically, and the reason that I do that, I'll share it with you, and maybe you can kind of help me to understand this, is I was thinking that the Q in queer include, like, who's not included in that, or isn't LGBT cover everyone? The Q, by my estimation, seems like more of a politicized version. Is that not accurate?
I definitely think that queer can be seen as, I'm trying to think of the right word, a very consciously chosen word because it is kind of political in the sense that queer used to be a derogatory term used to put down folks that were LGBTQ. Right. So similar to, I don't know if you know the history of the pink triangle, but how many folks have kind of like reclaimed the pink triangle, queer, the term fag, as saying like, yes, I am a fag, or yes, I am queer, or like I wear this pink triangle with pride. In whether or not they deem it a political act, I do see it as, for the most part, obviously it depends on the person, a conscious act to reclaim something that was used to dehumanize us as queer people. And so more specifically, like with queer, I personally prefer queer because as someone who exists outside of the binary, like both the sexuality binaries of straight and gay, right? Straight meaning man likes woman, woman likes man, and gay meaning man likes man, woman likes woman. And here I am as a non-binary, like transmasculine person. None of those terms like logistically work for me because I don't exist in the binary.
Trans doesn't work for you?
But trans is gender versus sexuality.
Okay.
So with sexuality, that would be like who you are romantically, sexually, or emotionally attracted to. And that could be people from binary genders like men or women, or that can be non-binary genders such as genderqueer, agender, pangender, all of those terms. But that's talking about, when we're talking about sexuality, you're talking about the attraction. And that can be broken down into the emotional, the romantic, and the sexual. And then when I'm talking about gender, that's the gender binary that we typically see within the United States is man and woman. And so we're talking about the gender binary, you have woman, you have man, and then you have me, and I'm not a part of that, right? Even if I didn't consciously choose to not be a part of it, I wouldn't be a part of it. I simply do not fit. Like the term woman does not fit me. The term man also doesn't fit me. And so when I came to the term, I first came out as genderqueer because I was like, all I know is that woman doesn't really feel right. But I don't know if I go so far as to say that I identify as a man. So I'm going to use they, them pronouns and just explore like this safety of being neither. And honestly, safety is probably not the best word because there is nothing safe about exploring my identity. Mm-hmm. And then after being referred to as Lex and with they, them pronouns, it just felt right. And I could not see myself ever going back to identifying as a woman because I never truly identified as a woman. It was more of an identity that I was forced into and attempted to like day by day survive in that identity because I didn't know I had the option of anything else. And it has nothing to do with, I didn't even know what trans people were or that it was safe and acceptable to be queer because I went to an all-girls school, in quotations, for 14 years. Yeah. And so in that space, trans people didn't exist. Right. Or the one trans person that I did know who happened to be my best friend was, and this was in high school, was harassed and ridiculed and just so dehumanized as well as other queer people to the point where they either left the school or you saw that you did not want to be treated in that way. Yeah. So as a form of self-preservation, I assumed that I like unconsciously buried my identity so deeply as to try and protect myself.
Yeah. I mean, that's okay. That makes sense. It's like more of like a catch-all. And that really makes sense to me. When you talk about, I want to talk about identity. And, you know, when you say like, you know, when you didn't feel like you fit in or didn't fit this binary or didn't like, I think that's something that you don't need to be a member of the LGBTQ community to understand and respect and feel, because I mean, I've been teaching for 15 years. I mean, even personally, there are things that I remember when I was a kid that I was like, oh, I like that. Oh, I shouldn't do that. You know, whatever it is. And you know, kids just, they're trying to figure out the world and how to survive socially and not bring out a negative attention their way. So they adopt these personalities that aren't necessarily them. And it becomes a very jolting thing for, I think, most kids of like, who am I and what do I like and why do I like the things that I like and all of that kind of stuff. And that gets to identity. And it was really cool because the first podcast I did was with Danny, and he said, you know, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? And I knew that it was a conversation about these issues. So I said, you know, I see, you know, a guy. And he said, well, so did I. And then what was interesting is I asked Corinna that question. Oh, no, before I asked Corinna, I'm sorry, I asked, just my friend was listening to this and he's like a Christian guy and he listened to it. And when he heard me ask that question, or Danny asked that question, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? He said, a loving child of God. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, that's not really that's a whole different thing. Then I asked Corinna and Corinna was like, oh, I see, you know, like a computer programmer. Like she wrote a book on computer programming. And I wonder, like, in identity, how do you identify? Because then I asked just directly, like, no, Corinna, like, how do you identify? Like, we're talking here about trans issues and stuff. And she was like, well, I don't, she's like, I guess she's older. You know, she's in her like mid 40s now. She said like, I guess a transsexual female, but it was just so interesting how identity is such a big part of this. And I think that if you identify as Black, or you identify as a woman, or you identify as trans, or you identify as a computer programmer, or you identify as a teacher or an athlete or whatever it is, that becomes so central to the way you obviously view yourself. That's got to play a big role in this whole conversation, right? Like how you identify that you could be a transgender individual, and that is kind of like number like 15 on your list about like how you identify. Like, I
Yeah,
don't think of
absolutely.
myself as like straight as like one of the top ones. So what are your thoughts on this? Because this is something that really hit me, and I think it's an important part of this conversation that I don't hear very often.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that.
Okay,
So I
please.
actually did a lot of independent research and through a class in college where it was psychology, but also looking at stigmatized identities and then the mental, emotional, and physical kind of consequences of having a marginalized or stigmatized identity within society. And so a lot of it had to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, like immigration status. And so, but before I go into what the research kind of shows on that, I do want to point out that the ways in which, so we definitely like kind of have a hierarchy of our identities, on like how we see ourselves and like what we would put as our top identities, because that's what we see as like kind of composing our heart and our soul. But then we also, something that is almost equally as relevant, I wouldn't necessarily say as important, but equally as relevant are our privileged identities. So even though you said that you wouldn't necessarily say that being straight is like top on your list, that's because it's a privilege to be straight, because you don't constantly think about being straight because it's not a marginalized identity that you have to fear. So when I was straight, I never thought about when I was straight. When I thought I was straight, I never really thought about my sexuality because there was no talk about it. There wasn't anything negative. It was just a thing. But then queer people, more generally speaking, and specifically for myself, the moment that I discovered I was queer, it never stopped. Like it's always been on my mind, because I know that I'm visibly queer in many spaces. I'm very vocally queer through my advocacy, and through having that stigmatized and marginalized identity. For me, it already is on like the upper parts of how I identify myself, because it's something that I am always consciously aware of. But I also, of course, know people who identify as LGBTQ, but maybe that's like the last thing on their list because they are more focused on their passion for animal welfare, whatever it may be. But I definitely think that the conversation has to be centered on how does the individual understand themselves, and then valuing and respecting that, because obviously what that person believes is true to themselves. But then also understanding that the identities that other people see us have, whether or not they are correct, if we are gaining privilege from them, also are like priority. So like I wouldn't put white as my top identity, but I have white skin and every day I benefit from white privilege. So that certainly should be an identity that's top of my list. But when I typically like say, when someone asks me, oh, what do you identify as? I'll say that I'm a queer, non-binary, trans-masculine, Jewish, animal lover, cat enthusiast, athletic human. Like that's like, those are the things that I say, like those are the things that matter most to me. But then again, like I didn't put white, and that's one of the main things that provides me safety and access to many things. And then as like a Jewish person, it's really important for me to I'm not wearing it right now, but like I have my Star of David, and like I love going to synagogue with my parents. And I have a Jewish teddy bear on my couch right now that lights up for Hanukkah. But so being Jewish is also an odd identity in the sense that I have white skin, but many folks would not say that I am white. But regardless of how you want to phrase or use the language, no one can object to the fact that I have white privilege, at least in like quick passings, and that makes me safer than folks who don't.
Yeah. So because I think we're talking about education, we're talking about how do we best serve kids, and how I think at the core of this, the most important thing is keeping children safe. And I don't mean safe in the way that I think it's sometimes being used now. I mean like physically safe. because I think in education, I think challenge is really good. I think I think school is not a place for your ideas to be safe. I think that school is a place for your physical safety and your emotional safety, but you have to be willing to challenge ideas. And that's what this whole podcast is all about. And, you're in school studying psychology and stuff like that. And, that's your background. The science around gender issues and all of the race issues and all that kind of stuff, all of the intersectionality and Kimberly Crenshaw and Peggy McIntosh and white privilege and all that stuff that is controversial. It is. I had on Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay on this podcast. I've read research by Deborah So, the sexual neuroscientist, and Kenneth Zucker and Brett Weinstein and God Sad. There's a lot of credible hard sciences and social sciences out there that is pushing back on the social justice stuff. And I am a part of the Heterodox Academy that's trying to bring about these conversations to basically have these tough conversations about why, how do we talk about race and how do we study race and gender in the most rigorous, best ways so we can have an understanding of truth and what is truth. So the science is very mixed on this. That a lot of really credible, wonderful, accomplished social scientists and hard scientists and biologists and neuroscientists and all these people, they disagree. There's disagreements about gender as a social construct, race issues, white privilege, all this kind of stuff. And I've had on people who are very credible from both sides. How do we as educators go about this? Because where I'm at right now, and I want to get your thoughts on this, where I'm at right now is I challenge it all. And I say, the way I approach science is, this is my hypothesis. I'm going to try and prove it wrong. I seek disconfirmation. Now, I understand that as a 6'3", 190-pound cis white male I'm from Pennsylvania too, but I had like a white picket fence and a perfect, I'm the top. I'm the ideal, whatever, society says, you have it the paved way. So I understand in that way that I probably feel more secure in doing this, but it doesn't change the fact to me that I want the best answers. I want the best ideas. So in a respectful, kind way, I want to challenge all of these things. I want to break down Peggy McIntosh or Barbara Applebaum or, Angela D'Angelo, who wrote White Fragility. Beverly, I forget. But all these books, I want to break them down and then challenge them. I think I'm going to try and prove myself wrong in these ideas. So how do you, I know that's a long kind of drawn out thing, but how do you approach the sciences? Do you actively read the other side? Do you actively go after those who are critical of the social justice sciences and things like that? Or do you just accept it as that's the way, that's the evolution of science and that's the right way? How do you deal with this? Because the science is so mixed on these issues. I'm curious. I'm really curious about this, and I'm trying to do it the best way. So I value what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a jumbled question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'll try and address as many parts as I can remember. I definitely think that it's complicated, so my response is going to be complex.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I also come from a unique perspective where I studied a rigorous field of psychology and gender, sexuality, and women's studies, where we read and we researched and we wrote and we did what all folks in academia do in looking at the research. And so I have the kind of academic side of what researchers have shown us, and then you also have history. So from as far back as there are, you can go, there have always been trans people. There have always been gay or pan or queer, whatever term you want to use, people. To the point where none of the identities aren't new, just the terms we're using and the language to describe and the ways in which it's manifesting itself is constantly evolving. And so the other thing is that, and I guess that this could also then be reversed, but I'm just going to say it anyway, but that you can't deny someone's lived experience. So if someone tells you that, so like in the sense where it's like, I could not change if conversion therapy or whatever forms of people trying to change me and making me say like, to go back on my gender, go back on my sexuality, none of that would work. Mm-hmm. Whether that's from the biology behind who I am or the ways that I was raised in accepting and loving myself for who I am. I mean, the talk within psychology is always, it's a mix of like nurture and nature. Yeah. Regardless of the topic you're going to break down, it's always like your biology and the experiences that make you who you are, or the things that you've learned as to what makes you, you. So, and I mean, honestly, just, so I've traveled and given lectures on gender called What's Gender, and I've also given lectures called What's Sexuality, where you just kind of break down the different acronyms and the LGBTQIA and what do these mean and what are examples for folks that haven't been exposed to that language. And for the most part, I come from the perspective of I'm going to share the terminology that we use to have these conversations so we can have a dialogue on these topics. And then I will provide statistics as to the percentage of folks who are LGBTQ, more specifically who are trans people of color, who are trans women of color, who are trans people of color who have been murdered because they are trans and a person of color. And the statistics never lie. The marginalization, the stigma, the harassment, abuse, and violence that marginalized groups face, like let's talk about like the Black community. When you have an intersectional identity of being Black and queer, or being, for instance, if you were raised as a Black girl, and then you have all of the stereotypes of being both Black and being a girl. Mm-hmm. But then you discover that no, this identity that was placed on you of being a girl doesn't fit, and you're actually a man. So then you, whatever the comfort level is, take the legal, social, and or medical kind of aspects of your transition to feel more authentically yourself. So then let's say that you start to physically alter your body. So now society has labeled you a Black man. Now you're dealing with the associations of being both Black and a man, which is very different than the associations of being both Black and a woman. Needless to say that the rates of kind of the negative consequences, whether it's the emotional or mental impact, and it's not because, oh, this is a disease or it's, I'm trying to think of all the negative stereotypes that come along with the queer community, perverted, diseased, those types of words. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that people that are queer deal with significantly higher rates of mental health issues because society will not let us live our lives. So
that's the narrative. Is there, as a scientist, is that like, what if there, I guess here's the question, is if there is proof that I could provide, and I'm not saying that there is, I don't, just hypothetically, is there proof that I could provide to get you to believe that that's not the reason why the mental health and, you know, suicide rates and depression rates among the community is because of society? Is there some sort of evidence that I could show you hypothetically, because I don't have it, that would get you to say, okay, that's more on the nature side than the nurture side?
I mean, if it existed, then I would be happy to read it, but there's a reason it doesn't exist, because it's not true. Because all of the studies show that through, whether it's like a longitudinal study of folks, interviews with family, friends, community, therapists, whatever it may be, this is like specific to the mental health rates. All of the evidence shows that the thing that makes a difference is support. literally one supportive parent can save a child from like attempting suicide within the trans community. And so in that realm, I'm always more than like, I would love to like engage in the conversation, right? If there is kind of evidence or support, I would say, I don't necessarily think evidence is the right word, but if there was support for the other side, I'd be willing to read it. But I also know that through my 4 years of studying the psychology and the sociology and anthropology behind it, that it is a societal, it's rooting from society, not from LGBTQ individuals.
Yeah, when I had James Lindsay on the podcast, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I'm not.
He, Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, they took on the gender studies and racial studies disciplines, and they wrote fake reports. So basically, they've been in the academic world, college professors and stuff for a long time, and they didn't believe the research. When you said like statistics don't lie, one of the things James Lindsay said is there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Is he felt like they were lying, and the way that they were structured wasn't being honest. So they wrote fake studies and got them published in like mainstream journals, academic journals, and even won awards because of it. And it's called like the Boghossian hoax. And they did this with a bunch of papers because they used like the language of the social justice movement and stuff like that to put everything about privilege and everything about, you know, racism and stuff like that. And things they actually took, this is something that's very interesting for you as a Jewish individuals. They took Mein Kampf, they took pieces of Mein Kampf and they changed Nazis to women of color and Jews to straight white men. And then they published, and it got published in an actual academic journal. And it was so startling because when I had him on the podcast, I was like, you messed with my head, James. You and Peter, I had them both on. Like, you guys messed with my head because I take academic journals very seriously. I take the university very seriously because I don't know anything. I'm such a rube. I just like take what is reality. Okay, well, the smart people at places like UPenn tell me this is reality, so I'm going to follow it. And then they showed that there is some level of there's people who have agendas even in the sciences, and those agendas, whether it's Ansel Keys being paid off by the sugar industry to say that sugar is good for you and fat's bad for you, which we know now is untrue, but there's people who have specific agendas. And you know, Judith Butler starting a lot of this, you know, she's a philosopher, she's not a scientist, but they're putting these ideas out there. This is where I'm really in such a tough spot about how to teach this, because there are studies out there that are not being sincerely done from a scientific perspective, from what I've seen. And I don't know, how do we reconcile, how do we know what's a good study? Like, how do we know what is good science and what isn't?
Yes. Okay. So I'm just trying to think of all the different things I want to.
Okay. Yeah. Please. Sorry. This is just something that's like always on my mind right now.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I do want to say is that even the things that we value, like we value science way above social studies or social sciences or lived experience. Why? Right? Like, why shouldn't we value philosophers who spend their lives dissecting the things that we take as given truths, who then discover that there are multiple ways to understand the same situation? I mean, I personally, yes, science is great because if you do a study, then you can attempt to have controls, and then hopefully it won't be a correlation and you'll have like a reason for it to be. But the majority of studies will never, ever be able to tell you, especially like with the things that we're talking about, that this is the thing that caused this. Because we can only talk about correlations. And so I think that that's also where the danger comes in, is that language can be tweaked. And then also, just before I forget, I think it's very morally just or ethically corrupt what the folks did by publishing false research, because many people will never know that like it's similar to like the vaccination, like, oh, vaccines are XYZ, and then people stopped vaccinating their kids.
Right.
So like I think one thing is we have to, like we're talking about, like, challenge everything. Don't take anything as fact. So yes, and then the other thing that I had to write down because I have 1,000 thoughts was that nothing is categorized or kind of understood to be science unless it's, or like a scientific fact, unless it is proven like time and time again by people, by different researchers, from public and private studies, from year to year, from different populations, from XYZ. Like you need to have the consistency of the results. And even like pharmaceutical companies are barely getting that for the drugs that are like put on our market. Like, so there's so many different things that come into, like, think about it. We came up with the language to say scientific fact. So we define what scientific fact is. Yeah. It's like, it's really like challenging everything that we know. And then I guess the other thing is that throughout college and through everything in grad school, it's always a focus on like peer-reviewed journals. So like, I don't know if any of the journals that published the folks you had on the podcast were peer-reviewed, or like what the kind of like
they were
the review board is for those studies. But I know that like the psych studies that I read in college, and my professors who were also like on the board and like were brought in to like read the like, they have to go through so many steps to even be considered for the major articles. And that's because peer reviewed is like the highest standard within the field, especially like within psychology. And so, oh my gosh, there were so many thoughts, and I feel like I kind of went off on one and then did it.
No, it's just confusing. I mean, that's the thing is like, but when you say like lived experience, that's very like kind of like Foucault. It's a little bit like, you know, like postmodernist, like, you know, and I think that's a great thought exercise. I think when you take postmodernism as like a thought exercise, like, let's just do that. I think that's very different, I suppose, than using that as being fact. Like that's, it's kind of two different worlds, right? Like one is just like a thought exercise, a way to think and a way to kind of expand your mind. And the other one is like, this is this is gravity. It's like, no, we can't blend those worlds. I mean, that's the way I kind of take it.
Yeah. And I think that like this is for me personally, like how I kind of value science, like social science and like social studies within itself, is that the science that I believe like full force is because there are the repeated studies that are published in peer-reviewed journals that have been replicated throughout the ages. Like, for instance, the fact that vaccines work, or like whatever else, like there is consistent and solid research that proves that that is the way things are. There's nothing that can prove or be suggested otherwise. But for things such as gender or sex, or things that don't necessarily have, whether it would be, no, callous is not the right word, like a cause or like a root from it, right? There are multiple things that make us the way and the people that we are. You can only rely so much on science. And that's the same way. You can only rely so much on information that needs to be consistently showing the same data. And that's not unique to the studies of sexuality, or like biological sex, or gender, or like minority experiences with mental health, right? Like there is so much out there that is truly just, honestly, it comes down to the fact that most of the world and the things that we are for sure that we know, we do not know. Society is extremely unstable. And most people will either subconsciously or consciously repress the fact that there is very little keeping us from chaos. Yeah. Because we want to feel safe. But the reality is that society is very unstable and very unbalanced. But we have this facade, whether it's from the government or our own desire to feel safe, to just say that we are safe.
Yeah, I'm feeling this tension right now, which is like not between you and I, just with these ideas, which is like it's like, how do we use language to to be more precise, because male and female, which was established, where, in mammals and whatever, like, but it's pretty established, but then it's like not really using like terms is like inclusive, like, because there are people who are like, no, I'm different than just that. It's not ones and zeros binary. Okay. There's something more to that, but that's in tension with, yeah. And the vast majority is ones and zeros. So like I have a friend, Sydney, who doesn't have feet, but we're not going to say that human beings don't have feet. But I have a friend who has 6 fingers. Are we going to say that people have 11 fingers? Or are we going to say that people have 10? It's like, well, we can say that sometimes people have 11 fingers. So it's this tension between, giving attention to how do we make this more correct, more true, what we have established, but also using like our energy and our efforts and our brains to try and go, okay, that's established. Let's move on to something bigger. Let's try and make a solar battery so we don't, die from climate change or something like that. Like that's where I feel this like tension with these issues. Is that kind of, do you feel that at all? Like that's where I'm at kind of in my head with this. Cause I think that there is something true to kind of both sides. I don't think it's merely one is right and one is wrong. I think that there is, otherwise it wouldn't be an issue. It wouldn't be controversial if this was as clear cut as I think most people on the sides, this little square and circle thing I have behind you. It's not just a square. It's not just a circle. There is some sort of tension there.
Right. I think that, so I think I'm going to push back against what you said, although we may be saying the same thing differently. There definitely is kind of like a right in the sense of queer folks and trans folks, because there are many folks that will say that being trans is either a mental illness or, like I said, like the other negative stereotypes, right, doesn't exist. Like I've had people tell me to my face that my identity doesn't exist, but I am here, and literally nothing they do can change that. So in the sense that, like, are trans people, do trans people exist? Do queer people exist? Like, there's no, like, yes or no, like, yes.
Yeah.
Do trans people, like, is being trans a mental disorder? No, absolutely not. And the Psychological Association and everyone has come to say being, whether it's trans or a different member of the LGBTQ community, is not within itself a mental disorder. The distress and the experiences through being in a society that, one, doesn't value you, and two, tells you that they'd rather not have you, put so much distress on the mind that gives many folks in the community anxiety, OCD, PTSD, trauma, whatever it may be. And so those are diagnoses of mental issues, but it's not stemming from being queer or being trans.
Can I ask you why? Like, well, and this is just a very sincere question. When someone says like, okay, I was born with, a vagina, or I was born with a penis, but I don't identify as that. My brain doesn't feel like it's right. Like my software doesn't match the hardware type of thing in some way. Like why is it, this is just a really sincere question. Like if we say it is a mental illness, couldn't that be better? Because when we have compassion for people with mental differences, and we all have some level of mental deficiency, all of us do. And if someone says, I am diagnosed as blank, like I feel like there's, from a lot of people, they go, oh, this is a medical thing. This is something that I'm going to show some compassion, because if it's an illness, we have compassion toward people with illness. And I'm not saying we should do that just to get compassion. I think you should have compassion without it. But I just wonder if we go down that route, if it would be better for the community.
So this is obviously my personal perspective.
Right. Yeah,
but I mean, so much research has tried to like prove that there's a gay gene, or prove that there's like something that makes someone like trans. And for the purpose of hoping that with some form of biological evidence, because science is favored over the social sciences or sociology, that through having that scientific proof, it would then protect those folks with those identities, or like you said, like create some form of sympathy or compassion. However, trying to think of the best way. But the other thing is that in an ideal world, everyone would have compassion and sympathy or empathy for folks who have different like neurocapacities, right? But a lot of times, and a lot of the research that I actually studied in my stigma class shows that folks that have diagnoses of mental health are then treated as helpless or as lazy. And so therefore they don't actually take a positive perspective of that individual or the community. They just see them as less than.
I thought it'd be the opposite. I thought it'd be if you were diagnosed with a learning disability, then people would be more compassionate and like, oh, you're not lazy, you actually have something, as opposed to just being like, oh, you're dumb or lazy. Wouldn't it be? I would think it'd be the opposite.
The problem is that then you also have like the terms like lazy, and then is the term lazy being put on a scholar of color versus like a white kid, because then there's the history of calling Black folks lazy, and then the extra stigma that comes from that. The issues that are also okay, so this is it. I accessed it in my mind. Okay, it's that if the diagnosis or the thing that makes the person who they am is deemed to be controllable. If it's seen as being controllable, then that person is, the word literally used in the study was despised, just like very negative, like I don't need to help that person. If the thing that the person is carrying with them is seen as uncontrollable, that's what generates the sympathy or the empathy.
You could just be living as a woman. You could just do it. Like, so that's why kind of thing.
I don't think I understand that part, but I'm going to go back to the learning disability part. Okay. Like learning disability, let's say for instance, you have a scholar who has a specific learning disability because they were exposed to alcohol or drugs, whatever it may be in the womb, right? So it's understood that this child could not control their environment, right? The reason why they may have their specific learning disability. So because their diagnosis and the way that they have come to be is seen by that individual as being not controlled, they would generate or be able to like have more sympathy or empathy or compassion and help from others because it's seen as something that cannot be controlled. Now, if it's someone, the other interesting thing is, and it's really a shame because like alcoholism and addictive personalities and like drug addiction is a mental illness. There is no doubt about it, right? It has to do with the way that our brains are formed and created, right? So be like alcoholism, like being addicted to drugs, right? There is something chemically within us that would make us more inclined, if not addicted to those things. However, the way that society views alcoholism is as it's something that can be controlled, even though it's not. And so because folks view it as something to be controlled, it does not generate as much empathy or sympathy and does actually make people more standoffish to wanting to help. Even though that is a true diagnosis that one has because it is uncontrollable. And so moral of the story is it depends on if folks view whatever the term or identity or label may be as something that can be controlled or was out of their control. Which then again comes into if folks view trans people in the first place as, if folks view trans people as not real in the first place, so then they're viewing and they believe that you can choose your gender identity. I personally believe you can choose your gender terms, but you can't choose your gender identity. It simply is what's in your mind and it's how you understand yourself. But for folks who believe that, no, like you can choose your gender identity. So they would see trans folks as having the ability to control their identities and therefore would not generate sympathy or empathy and would actually end up generating hatred against those folks for making society, I guess, more complicated or complex or whatever the reasons are. But another big reason is you have to be asking, like, who has a problem with folks identifying as trans or queer or whatever it may be? Are those the white, cis, het, able-bodied, able-minded, Christian, name all of the things that are not minorities in society. Are those the folks that are pushing back against this? Because in my personal experience, it is. And it's because they lose grip on their undeserved privilege by creating access for folks who are not born with those same privileges.
Well, I'm that, and I'm not doing that. So again, like, whatever groups you identify with and as, I think that there is a danger in saying, everyone, which I'm not saying you're saying, but I'm just that everyone from this group is this way, because I created this platform and I want to give, I'm genuinely curious, and I really I care about, LGBTQ kids. I really want to make sure that they can be growing up in a world where they're the best suited for living their best life. We've done an hour. I think that, like, there's so many things. I love these conversations because they're difficult, and there's a lot of struggle and kind of and working through it. And there's things that you said that I disagree with, and there's things I said that I'm sure you do or would disagree with. I think that part of what I do is I seek disconfirmation instead of confirmation bias. Like, if there was a study that said caffeine causes breast cancer, okay, then female coffee drinkers would be like, let me see this study. What are you talking about? They go through, this can't be right. This can't be right. I love my coffee. But men who don't drink coffee would go, checks out. Like, there is that element of like if it affects you, if it says like this group is this thing and that doesn't fit, then, we all are these individuals that have these biases and have these identities. And when we are doing the science, it can get messy. And that goes for people who are kind of pushing against the LGBT social justice agenda and those who are pushing for it. And I think that the more that each side decides, and this is like kind of my spiel to the audience, to whatever you believe to be true, try to prove it wrong. Try. Because if you can't prove it wrong, it's probably true. And if you can, well, good, because now you have to add that new information to what you believe, because you don't want to have bad ideas. You don't want to believe something that's not true. And, you can assimilate that to what you know to be true about yourself. Like, the outside world is going to be the outside world, and you are going to be you. So you can take this thing, and don't think that you're so fragile that you can't, change your mind on things. You can, and you'll survive, because we're all a lot stronger than we might think we are sometimes. Lex, where can people find you, see what you're up to, get in contact with you? I hope that there's some young people who are struggling with some issues, and they might not want to talk to someone like me, which, sometimes they do, but I get if they don't. And they might want to reach out to you, or you would be able to steer them in the right direction or something. So where can people find you? If you can just give that out, and then I can close this out. Yeah,
absolutely. So I use Instagram as my main platform for my visibility, sharing my story, and connecting with folks, answering questions, just the whole thing. And so my Instagram is at Lex_Horwitz. I also have a Facebook page that is, if you search like the @ and then Queer Resist Lex, it will come up. And so I also share resources or articles on there. I also have a YouTube channel, which I haven't had time to post to since I graduated from college, but it is there with recordings of my What's Gender lecture, my Let's Talk About Sexuality lecture, amongst talking about, I have a very specific video that talks about gender as a social construct. Would highly recommend you looking at it and then having a conversation on that. Because I always will run into folks that believe differently, and so I like having these conversations. I do have a Twitter. It's also at Lex_Horwitz. And I think that's it. But I also have my email, which is queerresistlex@gmail.com. And I can also send you these things so that you can provide them to folks. Yes. But like I said, the reason why I am so active and visible and vulnerable and just authentically myself is because I want to have these conversations, right? I want people who share my identity to ask me questions. I want people who are very different than me to ask me questions, or to at the very least engage in conversation, because we're both going to be able to learn something from that.
Yes. And Lex, sincerely thank you for doing this. I had a couple of people on the podcast who were talking about social justice stuff, and I gave a little bit of pushback, not nearly even as much as I gave today. And they stopped talking to me. And I was trying to be polite, and I'm just genuinely curious, and they stopped talking to me, and it really stinks. So I really sincerely, Lex, thank you for engaging in these conversations. It's the only way we're going to all get better as a society is if we can model this, if you and I can model this, and maybe other people can model it with their family members or friends and things like that. Maybe we'll get somewhere. Maybe we'll get somewhere better in society. So thank you so much for doing this. It's really been awesome. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. This has been Cylinder Radio. The success of this podcast and the educational revolution that I hope you will be a part of is dependent on those who find value in it. Please take a few moments to review us on iTunes so the show is more easily found. If there was a perspective on today's topic that was not highlighted in this episode, or you have an idea for an episode topic that you want to understand more deeply, please email us at cylinderradio@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @WillRusch, WILLREUSCH. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to the next one.